Board of Supervisors regular meeting. We did not have a closed meeting.
No, just note that Mr. Frazier is joining electronically from his workplace for personal reasons.
Thank you.
No one here with me.
Well, hopefully you got dinner. Let's see. All right, public hearing comes before public comment. Okay. You gonna speak to the
Yes,
public
we have
hearing?
a single public hearing tonight. Bonnie will introduce that, and then you can open the floor to public input.
Okay, good evening. So the state of Virginia requires localities to hold a budget public hearing when amendments to the annual budget total 1% or more of the original budget. And all of the budget adjustments that the board has approved to date total about $400,000 short of the 1%. But others that staff needs for you to consider this evening would bump us over the 1% limit. And so we have advertised a public hearing for this evening to get public comments about that budget adjustment, the summary for which is here on the slide from the agenda item. So with that, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, or I'll ask that you open the public hearing.
Looks like we're going to public hearing. All right, thank you, Bonnie. At this time, I'll open this portion of the meeting for public hearing with regards to this item only. If you have anything you would like to address, please be recognized, come up to the mic, and give us your name and your district so that the folks on Zoom also know who is speaking. Not seeing anyone jumping up in the room. Is there anyone on Zoom wishing to speak during this public hearing? Please raise your Zoom hand. Well, that was a quick one. Not seeing any hands, I'll close the public hearing and open it to...
Madam Chair, I did have a question. I just wasn't quick enough on the draw.
Yes, sir.
This is Kier, obviously, or not to be confused with Mr. Frazier. So, Ms. Jewell, the second, I guess the second figure in that table that's been pulled out, described as contracted transfers between funds on previously approved supplemental appropriations. I wonder if you could put that in layman's terms for me. I'm not sure that I follow.
Yes, absolutely. So the original budget each year includes transfers between funds. So there may be a transfer, for example, of general fund dollars to the capital projects fund to pay for cash funded capital projects. Because that's part of the original calculation of the 1%, when budget amendments are made, we need to track those transfers between funds as part of what is contributing to the 1%. And so this actually is a correction of several previously approved transfers between funds that was not appropriately reflected on the tracking sheet.
Okay, and then just reading down in the table, I see the high school shelter generator project. So should I consider some of that $238,000 be part and parcel of the separate $464,000 line item, or are we talking two separate things?
Two separate things. So the actual generator carryover amount itself for the project is roughly 1/2 of that $464,000 that you see there in the middle of the table, and the other half of the $464,000 is the transfer of funds between funds. So we have to budget not only the project itself, but the transfer that's coming from the general fund.
Okay.
So in the past we've handled this on the backside, but it's more transparent to show it in this manner.
Okay. So I guess when I'm thinking about just the budget, our budget to me always appears inflated well above actual revenue because the transfers get sort of tacked on to our actual revenue numbers. Is that kind of what's going on here?
Yes, it is. It is, because the transfers are being double counted, if you will, in the budget,
That's,
but are excluded from the appropriations.
thank you. I didn't want to say double counted, but you did, so you helped my understanding. All right, or confirm my understanding. All right, thank you. That's all I have.
So if the board is interested in moving this forward, there's 2 resolutions provided for you in the packet. One amending the budget, and then the second amending the supplemental appropriations for this year.
I would make a motion that we adopt the resolution appropriating funds for the amended fiscal
Can
year budget.
we do the budget first and then the
Okay.
appropriations? Thank you.
I was just taking them in the order they were on.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I would make a motion that we adopt the resolution approving an amended fiscal year budget beginning July 1st and ending June 30th, 2023 for Rappahannock County, Virginia,
I'll
as
second that
attached.
motion.
Thank you. Just roll call.
Motion and a second. Any discussion?
Glad we could get through these cleanup items. It's always nice to square up.
We'll do a roll call vote. Mr. Frazier?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Carney?
Aye.
Mr. Whitson?
Aye.
And I also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then the appropriation.
Well, I'm on a roll, so I'll make a motion that we adopt the resolution appropriating funds for the amended fiscal year budget beginning July 1st, 2022 and ending June 30th, 2023 for Rappahannock County, Virginia.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Roll call assume. Mr. Frazier?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Carney?
Aye.
Mr. Whitson?
Aye.
And I also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie.
All right, going into public comment for the evening. Anyone wishing to speak, if you'll be recognized and come up to the mic and give us your district and your name, I'd appreciate it. And that way people on Zoom can do the same. Anyone wishing to speak, public comment?
On anything that's on the agenda this evening?
And come on up. Yes, ma'am. Come on up, Sheila.
Oops. Sheila Gressinger, Hampton District. I missed you this afternoon. I had to go to another meeting, but I'm back. With some interesting things to think about. I went to the parade yesterday. It was absolutely magnificent. And while I was waiting on the street corner, I started talking to a guy next to me, and turns out he was going to take a picture of his wife who was in one of the floats, and we were talking about how long he'd been living in the county, not very long. He lived on the other side of Sperryville, and I said how wonderful it was to see such a magnificent outpouring of wonderful stuff going on in Little Washington. And he mentioned how wonderful he thought Sperryville was, how it had so much going on and everything. And that made me a bit sad, because I've been here 40 years, and I remember when there was a vibrancy in Little Washington, and it sort of faded and went away. And I've heard people complain that there aren't enough people living there. And unfortunately, when anybody does sort of come in with some ideas, they're sort of, I'd call it, run out of town. And my example would be Mr. Abdo came in with some wonderful ideas about, I think, 8 years ago. And he put his ideas to rest. So I wrote a commentary in the paper last week, and it was called Chaos. And it's something that I keep in my house, and it says, where great dreams begin. And it says that a lot of times people encounter great difficulty when they're trying to accomplish something. And certainly Little Washington has encountered great difficulty. And it said, then it gave an example as a tiny plant has to break through the soil to become the great tree. And so I think I'm hoping that it's time that we've gone through enough chaos in this county, and it's time for the little plants that have been sort of hovering beneath the soil in a lot of different places, but including Washington, that they'll be able to spring forth and we can be more of the great county that I know we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Anyone else wishing to speak? Anyone on Zoom wishing to speak at this time? Please raise your Zoom hand. Not seeing any hands, I'll close public comment. And we move into presentations.
Probably appropriate for you to read that into the record and share it with our visitors.
Easy for him to say. Resolution of appreciation and commendation from the Rappahannock County Board of Supervisors to Sperryville Volunteer Fire Department Incorporated for 75 years of service to the community. Whereas Sperryville Volunteer Fire Department was organized and chartered in 1947 by a small group of dedicated citizens, and whereas Sperryville Volunteer Fire Department has grown from a company that first used a government surplus 1938 open cab fire truck to a firefighting organization deploying modern apparatus including Attack 2, Brush 2-1, Engine Tanker 2, Rescue Engine 2, Utility 2, and Tower 2, the only tower truck housed in Rappahannock County. And whereas the essential services of SVFD would not be possible without many devoted volunteers who have served the community of Sperryville and Rappahannock County over 3/4 of a century. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Rappahannock County Board of Supervisors does hereby recognize 75 years of vital service and expresses its highest appreciation to SVFD for its significant contribution to the citizens and visitors of Rappahannock County, and commends the department and the volunteer members who have served it for outstanding service to the citizens and visitors of Rappahannock County. And be it further resolved that this resolution be spread across the minutes of the Rappahannock County Board of Supervisors for all citizens to reflect upon the service and accomplishments of this dedicated, volunteer-driven fire department. Adopted this 5th day of December 2022. Thank you very much.
75 years.
So we'll let you disperse those.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Behind you wants a picture too.
That's right.
Actually, Jerry's right in.
Would you need this?
Thank you.
He is.
Well, this is a first. Mr. Whitson and Mr. Frazier, we have got.
Oh, my
Is this the first time you've done challenge coins?
Yes, sir.
That's pretty cool.
That is awesome.
We have challenge coins that were given to us from Sperryville Volunteer Fire Department.
That's awesome.
Sorry, I missed that.
It's a coin that they are giving to all of us, and it's very well done.
I think the challenge
Beautiful.
coin history goes back to military days where the officers would meet each other and exchange basically a coin identifying what regiment or whatever they're with, and it became a phenomenon in the military.
A lot of departments do now, and we decided to do one for 75th. We didn't do one for 65th, so hopefully we'll be here at 100. Somebody might be here. I don't know. We'll continue the tradition.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Classification and compensation
And
study.
you gentlemen are welcome to be here for this entire program, or
Good night.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Frazier's just on the phone, so he won't be able to see those
Oh, no,
things.
he's on.
Oh, okay, good.
I can see the,
See if I can.
Excellent.
Okay. So this is some draft information. I'm not going to call this final. This is a preliminary report on the classification and compensation study that has been an ongoing project in county administration for several years now. After a good amount of work had been done prior to the pandemic hit. This had to be paused, excuse me, and then we've picked it back up within the last couple of months to try to bring it to a sense of finality. So we have been working with a consultant, Baker Tilly, on this study, and they have collected data from us, all sorts of data, and then used it in their proprietary system known as SAFE, or Systematic Analysis and Factor Evaluation. They reviewed employees' responses to job questionnaires that were completed prior to the pandemic and submitted to Baker Tilly, and then some standardized position descriptions. Maybe not Rappahannock specific at this point, but we're still working on that. But standard position description to assess 9 different factors of each position. And those 9 factors are here on the screen. They are training and ability required for the position, experience required for the position, the level of work that one would do within the position, human relations skills, that is the degree to which and the difficulty of which an employee would interact with members of the community or with differing officials. So somebody who needed to speak with the governor's office would be rated a higher level of difficulty within human relations skills than with somebody who didn't have that responsibility. The physical demands of the position, working conditions and hazards associated with the position, independence of action were required by the person within that position, the impact of their duties and their decision-making on end users, the so what factor, if you will, and then the supervision exercised by that employee, not the supervision that they receive, but what they exercise in execution of their job duties. Through their system, after reviewing this information that was provided by the county and the employees in positions, Baker Tilly then assigned a total point value to each position that we were wanting to put on a pay scale, so that positions could be, with comparable requirements, could be placed across the organization and matched up with other positions having those same general number of points and the same expectations and duties, relatively speaking, assigned to those positions. Baker Tilly used survey data that was received from surrounding and small jurisdictions. Those include Clark County, Fauquier, King George, Madison, Page, Shenandoah, and the town of Warrenton to complete their market assessment. And that honestly was done several years ago, and I'll talk in a bit about how they then aged that data to bring it forward to today's market. They, Baker Tilly, Mr. Curry, could you advance the slide?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Taking notes.
Thank you. Baker Tilly analyzed the data provided by these localities for each position and determined the market rate salaries. Baker Tilly gauged the midpoint rate on the scale as the rate at which an employee who achieves full competency in the position's duties would be paid initially. So once they get to that point of full competency, they should be at the midpoint as judged by, as recommended by Baker Tilly. They then recommend a 40% spread within each grade's minimum and maximum salaries surrounding the midpoint. So the maximum is 40% higher than the minimum. Market comparisons made several years ago before the pandemic were then aged by Baker Tilly to reflect current market conditions. county administration staff, then we wanted to gauge whether that aging was appropriate relative to others' current fiscal 23 pay scales. And so we then gathered the fiscal 23 pay scales from Page, Madison, Culpeper, and Fauquier, and performed our own independent sampling using those pay scales of positions to ensure that the across-the-board aging that Baker Tilly did seemed to be a fit for where we really are. Resulting from that work is the draft pay scale that's part of your agenda item tonight. This is like I said, is a draft pay scale, and it's subject to change as the job descriptions are fine-tuned by departments. And then the consultant performs a final analysis of those fine-tuned job descriptions. So we've talked with the department heads, and they are currently working on the fine-tuning of those job descriptions, which we expect will be finalized for us to provide to Baker Tilly in the mid to late December timeframe. And then we would get a final analysis from Baker Tilly as to whether there are changes stemming from those fine-tuned job descriptions. Just as a reminder, no pay scales currently exist within Rappahannock County government. And in most cases, we are developing career ladders that haven't previously existed. So we've taken the standardized job descriptions, and that's why the fine-tuning is now needed to apply those to what might be effective one day in Rappahannock. So the next slide, please. Thank you. As work continues, there's not a final cost estimate at this point for implementation of the options. However, these are Baker Tilly's recommended options, and we asked them about this. They said these are their standard implementation options. The first of which is to move employees whose current salaries are below the minimum of their new grade to the minimum. And this is an order of magnitude estimate for each of these options. $70,000 would be the full year cost of implementing that. And since the board will be considering potential mid-year implementation, of course, the cost would be half of that $70,000. The order of magnitude cost of option 2 is $120,000 for the full year cost, and that option 2 is to move employees to the minimum of their new grade if their current pay is less than the new minimum, or provide a 2% increase, whichever is greater. Again, that full year cost is $120,000. And then finally, option 3 is move to the minimum of the new scale if an employee's pay is currently below that, and provide 0.5% increase for each year of service in that position in Rappahannock. And the cost of that for full year would be approximately $150,000 or about $75,000 for a mid-year implementation.
And
And
just want
yes.
to make sure it's clear, these implementation costs, those are burden costs with VRS and
VRS Life and FICA factored in, yes. Yes.
And they're
And just to be
preliminary.
clear, these options all are based on a one-time cost, right? This is not recurring at all.
No, these would be recurring costs because the salary increase would be ongoing.
The board has built into your budget the last couple of years recurring dollars to implement this. Those recurring dollars have been, in this current fiscal year, are budgeted in the Board of Supervisors contingency budget with recurring revenue. And so in implementing, what you would be doing ultimately is transferring those budget dollars from the Board of Supervisors budget into the departments where adjustments need to be made.
Right.
Okay, sorry, I got it. And then, real quickly on the 40% spread within a grade, what, is that just a number that the consultants came up with, or is it based on something? Is that like a normal kind of local government minimum to maximum spread within an employment grade?
The typical that I've seen and that we saw as we were looking at other localities is something more like 60% spread. And we, to some degree, I'm going to use the word challenged the consultant as to why that was appropriate. And the response was that really, on average, some jobs do take much longer period to get to that level of proficiency, but others take a much shorter period of time, depending upon the complexity of the position. And so they felt like 40% was a good happy medium, if you will.
Okay.
And I think where you might see an issue is the upper end, the max of a particular grade. If you had an employee who stayed in the same job for a very long time, with a 40% spread, they could start bumping into the max, potentially. Most situations, that employee is probably going to have an advancement opportunity, we hope, and with the career ladders, that rather than staying in grade for 20 some odd years, they will not be in the same grade. They will advance to a new grade and work their way on a new 40% scale, but not always.
Not dissimilar from the GS schedule in the federal government, correct?
I think those might be step-based, which is a different animal altogether.
They're grades, and then each grade has steps, and then you go to a whole new grade, which then has steps.
Right. Typically, the only way to advance inside a grade is through merit increases. When the board provides COLA increases, generally the entire grade scale will advance up that percentage. So you just kind of keep steady wherever you were. That can lead to some compression issues when you bring new people on at the bottom end of the scale and your current staff hasn't advanced up the scale. That's one of the reasons why the consultants recommend things like option 3, which helps spread your long-term employees who've been in grade a long time, can push them up the scale and differentiate them from somebody hired off the street tomorrow.
So owning my own business, completely different than the government world of pay scales. But if you have someone achieving full competency at the midpoint rate, what's the incentive? I mean, are you basically just saying every year you're going to get a small raise for the rest of your life, no matter what you do? I mean, to me, there's not a whole lot of, I know it's government, but not a lot of excitement in that way of doing things.
Some employees might be satisfied with being a dishwasher their entire life, and they might move at the midpoint or beyond, but others will see the opportunity to know that they can move on to be a line cook, and then whatever comes after that, a head chef. And so it's that advancement opportunity with the career ladder that we want to provide opportunity. And it's also an opportunity for the management to identify high achievers who are providing great value to the organization and who might have opportunities to go elsewhere, and we can retain those high achievers here through opportunity of promotion if they're doing additional work. So just being here a long time doesn't mean you can advance from one career rung to the next. You must bring additional skills to the organization. And I'm sure we'll train you to get these additional skills.
Anybody else?
The note I made earlier was that, I'll have to go chase it down, but the state does require us to have a classification system when you exceed 15 employees, or at least that's what it used to say.
Oh.
We're a little behind in that.
And you've had conversations with the different department heads? And
We have had conversations with the constitutional officers, and not other departments beyond that. Honestly, a lot of those report to Mr. Curry, so we've not branched out beyond that, but we have talked with each of the constitutional officers.
getting feedback, pros, cons?
We have gotten some feedback, and a lot of it involved, we really need to shore up those job descriptions, and Gary and I both definitely agree with that.
So you have 4 of your constitutional officers here. I don't know if they,
That's kind of what I was wondering.
it's
Can
an
I
opportunity.
just ask a question about the disparity between option 2 and option 3? It seems like there's not enough money in that line for option 3. When I think about the number of employees we have and their length of service, for there to only be a $30,000 discrepancy or difference between option 2 and option 3. But y'all computed those numbers and did you max out at any
So,
certain number
I
of
think-
years or?
Well, I don't know that we really did a lot of back checking on the analysis that was done by Baker Tilly, but understand this is in grade, so let's take a long time sheriff employee, Major Jenkins. He's not been major for 25 years. He's been a sheriff's office deputy for 25 years. So it's looking at that sort of scenario. Now, it gets a lot more complex when we get to departments where there really haven't been a lot of different positions available. They just have gained knowledge and experience and expanded their capability, but didn't really get a new title.
So it's not just for each year of service, it's for each year of service in that position?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's my
thank you.
understanding.
That would make sense.
And the sheriff's office is, by and large, most of your employees.
Okay.
And they're the ones,
'Cause
I have the most
that thinking,
career
oh,
learning.
that can't be enough money. Thank you.
There are, we'll note, there are a few positions that were pulled out of the costing analysis. Shared with you in the past, Mr. Polster's position, it's graded on the scale where it's most appropriate if we have to hire in, but as you're aware, Mr. Polster's requested a lower salary for other reasons, and we'd be happy to accommodate him. So the increase that would be required to bring him to that position is not in here.
If you all agree, I would like to hear if any of the
Sounds good.
officers in the room would like to speak.
Absolutely.
Come on up to the mic.
Has the board received, Peggy Ralph, clerk of the circuit court, started working here in 1981, seen lots of changes. I would like to know if the board has been given these classifications that we received in our meeting with Mr. Curry. And,
No, they have not received,
okay,
Well, it's on, what's online.
but not the job description.
the job descriptions.
No.
Can I ask why?
Because you're the expert.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert, but I will tell you this. We are small offices. For example, in the clerk's office. For many years, we worked just 2 of us. Now we are 3. We all do basically the same thing. That's how we work with our residents. That's how we work with the people that come to see us, with the attorneys, title searches. I personally do not like the concept of classifying my people, who are very, very competent, into a class. I believe that they should be rewarded for the work they do in total, which is what they do. They work very hard for the money that they get. These descriptions that we have, we are going to work on them. Is that the plan? They're too specific as to class in many ways. In some ways, they're very general as to class. When you get them, you will see that they are quite extensive. And yet I can tell you that the jobs that the people do in my office are far wider than these. You can't imagine the jobs that the people that work in the clerk's office do. I have a book, it's 800, the clerk's office has 800 duties. The book that I have is about this thick. But the most important thing to me is that when someone comes into my office unhappy, which is most of the time, I want them to leave being happy. And I can tell you that my staff does their very, very best to do that. And most of you know that I will be leaving. I came here kind of support to my other constitutional officer friends who also have staff that are wonderful and work very hard for the residents of this county. I didn't feel it was my place to tell you what you should do in the future, but I do know what we have done in the past. And service is our #1 goal. And making our residents feel confident in the people that are serving them, because that's why we are here. And telling them the truth, and not worrying about that this is an elected position. Always tell them the truth. If it hurts them, I'm sorry. But I made a promise when I ran at one point, I'm not too sure, and I said, when you come to my office, my main goal when you come in is to leave my office smiling, no matter what I tell you. And I would hope that's true of everybody else. I think it is. In fact, I know it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Deborah Nick, treasurer. The classifications concern me because, like Peggy said, we're an office of 3. We've been an office of 2 for almost 2 months now, and because of an illness and then a death. So if I bring in someone, if I had a vacancy and I brought in someone, the training would be a very short period of time, because offices this small, you have to hit the ground and you have to run. We were 2 people during tax season. We just finished tax season with 2 people in the office for 2 months. You have to hit the ground running. We don't have time for 2 years or a year of a trainee, even if we had a vacancy. We don't have it. All of my deputies, my 2 deputies, they're trained at the highest level because they could be there by themselves one day. They have to close. It just so happened one of my deputies, like I said, illness and then a death. The other deputy had to pick up, they all have to do the same thing because you never know when someone's going to be out. And I think all of our offices are like that, unless you do have a trainee. And then the classifications, the 70,000, if this board or the administration doesn't already know, or Baker Tilly already know where our employees are going to be placed, in which level, then how did you arrive at the 70,000? It doesn't add up. You already know where my employees are going to be placed without my input. Otherwise, these options, you couldn't do it. You couldn't give them a number if you didn't know what classifications either of my deputies were going to be. So we're working on the job descriptions, but I do have concerns.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Debbie.
Mary Graham, Commissioner of the Revenue. To reiterate what my colleagues have said, I am in the position of hiring new people, and I had someone start just last week. And in one short week, I was just trying to catalog the number of different processes she had to be introduced to and start to learn. And it's at least 8 just last week. And that's during a period when we have, the steady flow was land use reports and just how you take those in. But besides that, we had abatements and supplementals and tax returns and all these other things, and monthly reports and weekly reports. And she was introduced to every single one of those. Yes, she is hitting the ground running. The training period is going to be minute because you have to serve. You have to serve whoever walks in the door. and be able to help them and be competent. And that's what my people have to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
This might be a really dumb question. Mark Goff, for Commonwealth's attorney. I don't understand what the points are over on this side of the chart there. What is that supposed to be?
These are the points that Baker took standardized job description when they ran them through their system using those 9 evaluation points.
Okay, so the higher the number, the greater the salary?
Yes, the higher the number, the higher the grade.
Okay.
That'd be the greater the combination of those 9 factors that require autonomy or consequence if the actions are not appropriate, or they talk to the governor or whatever.
I do that every day, so. So in my office, there's part of the development has been historical. When Sharon and Peter were sharing the office in private practice and Mrs. Jennebach was in there, and then Ms. Giles, you had somebody else in there answering the phone, in addition to doing, what I call the more complicated tasks of the legal assistant. That sense has, gone by the wayside over the years, but still, that lead that's left Ms. Giles in her position, and she's been there a very long time, so well over 30 years. Maybe I don't know exactly how long. Yeah, and so she's the proverbial frog in boiling water. Started out cold, but now it's boiling, and she does all of this stuff. And it is like my colleagues, the constitutional said, you got to hit the ground running. If something happens to Pat, I'm in bad shape because now I'm the frog in the boiling water, because not only am I coming over here and doing all the prosecution and doing the work for the board, I'm also answering the phone, looking at envelopes, and filing stuff. So attracting people that have the abilities is, when it gets to that level of all these years of accretion of responsibility, it's almost impossible to find somebody to replace someone at that level. So it may come, and I've suggested and had this conversation with Connie and Gary, that at least in my office, we might have to be looking at, number one, more money and 2 positions. And that's not entirely reflected here. I think the concept was you start as a legal assistant and then you work your way up to a paralegal. Well, that doesn't happen. That's not really, those are 2 different animals. A paralegal has gone to school for at least 2 years, like beyond high school. And also too, when you're trying to compete with Prince William and with Fairfax and Arlington and all that, you're gonna have to pay to get somebody of that caliber out here. So I just would, I love the idea, but I think that perhaps, in my view, humbly, it's perhaps a little too rigid to try to get, E1, E2, E3, E4, senior enlisted, and then the officer corps, in that strict sort of lineup of positions and responsibility. So at least for a little county like us, I think probably we ought to paint, as far as it comes to personnel in our constitutional offices, with a much broader brush. And the time is coming, and I'm sure, like in my case, Ms. Giles is going to want to retire sometime. And so I'm going to be faced with that. And I believe it's going to take 2 positions to replace her. One at a receptionist level at a much lower rate of pay, and one at a paralegal level. Because if I want a paralegal and I've got to tell them, well, you got to sit here and answer the phone all day and take messages and file and type and do all this, they're going to say, I don't want that job. I'm a paralegal. I want to spend my time doing paralegal stuff and not doing receptionist stuff. So I'm just asking that there be maybe a degree of flexibility built into the concept, so that would allow the system and the pay grades to actually reflect our little tiny offices. And remember, some we've been around, I've been around that long, but Peggy.
I've been around.
But, I think you're I don't know, 11, 12 years or something. And and remember how it all started. Things have blown up exponentially as far as the workforce of the county, even in the time that I've been here. So I just want to say it's an extremely laudable effort to get this kind of organized. But I do believe that, well, I said maybe a little bit more flexibility based on the actuality of the office's job. And all of our offices do very different things. You know, the prosecution has nothing to do with what Debbie and the commissioner Peggy do. It's completely different things. That's why that's why the Constitution separates us. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
Art hits on a good point in that everybody's doing different things, and you might have somebody who's taking calls versus somebody who is responsible for the highest levels of responsible work. And those individuals need to be paid a different amount. Mm-hmm. And there has to be reasonable equity to figure out that relative amount. And so classification is put in place to do that. I'll maintain that the career ladder is an opportunity for growth of our employees to gain additional skill and achieve additional and higher salaries. The state, through the comp board, that's how they function. You know, these roles and positions are mimicked after the comp board. But you don't have to do that here. And you can just have deputy. But is the salary range going to be from the absolute minimum of the lowest deputy to the absolute highest of the chief deputy? And how do you recognize when it's appropriate to provide increases? And when somebody comes in at the very lowest level, are they responsible for these tasks, or are they able to follow directions to do tasks? And that's two very different things. We can lay out tasks and orders of operations for people to do, but that's different than walking away and saying, you are responsible for this outcome. And when somebody else comes in, maybe train them. I think it's very difficult to have a range that might go from 30,000 to 70,000 or something like that, and manage that employee throughout that growth. What is the differentiator?
I don't know, because I was just sitting here thinking about it. I don't think I've ever come to this board and asked for an increase in a salary for Ms. Giles or for myself. I think we were graciously given a $10,000 all constitutional some 10 years, 8 or 10 years ago. But I don't think that, I know in my experience, I've never come in and asked for step increases, because generally with Ms. Giles anyway, my only employee quote, that's been handled by these across the board things where the state kicks in, like last year, was it 5% or something, or the board will increase 2%, and over time, that adds up. But I'm not sure that it just really works any other way in reality. It's kind of, you come in during have a budget session and say, well, I think, employee A is doing a great job and want an increase, and then, I don't do that for the other one. I understand that problem with that. So I don't know the solution. I'm just saying that as far as pay increases go, generally, I think, I don't know what y'all's experience is, but generally it's just been everybody got it, except the county attorney.
Not always.
But most of the time, right? It's been that way. No one's come in and individually lobbied for a particular employee's salary going up. In my experience, I might be wrong.
Well, I have to say, I just want to interject here. I think I'm one of two members of the original board that requested this pay scale study. We started it back in 2018 here, 2019. And one of the reasons it seemed like such a good idea at the time was because we do have employees that aren't organized under the board, library employees and employees that report to the electoral board. And wanting to have a sense of fairness and to allow all departments to be able to sort of advance their employees and do the things that were being brought to us that didn't fall under our purview. That was sort of the spirit that we undertook this in, and that there was an attempt to establish some system in the chaos. But I understand that it's a work in progress, and I do think that I hope that it still has merit, and that with feedback and refinement, it can be a useful tool.
Just,
Mr. Golfer, you done?
Yes,
I didn't mean to interrupt you all speaking, but I just wanted to point out that not everybody on this sheet gets budgeted through us.
well, one way or another, but you don't have finite control.
That's correct.
I have a suggestion to all of you. I have an invitation to all of you. I don't see how you can have some of these things unless you know what we do. So, the clerk's office, and I'm sure the commissioner and the treasurer, I'm not sure, but I'm hopeful, would like all of you at one time or another to come to our offices, spend time with us, see what happens in Rappahannock, not what happens in Fauquier, Madison, or any other county. We are special. You think we're special? I think we're special. And I think that you need to realize that what makes us special are the people that serve. I said this before. Please, I invite you, spend a day, spend a week, and see what goes through our office. Some days, it's going to be really quiet. Other days, it's going to be really noisy. I have had to ask people to leave because they have been so rude. But if you talk to them and you make them realize that you understand their problem and their angst, they will come by. They will come. I have had people come in and say, this is a will and you're not keeping it. Well, we have to keep it. Or I'm not coming back here. Saying to a resident, you're being very rude to my staff. And if you cannot be pleasant, I'm going to ask you to leave. And if you refuse to leave, I will call the sheriff's office. So please, we won't ask you to leave, but please come. See what we do. See how what I do impacts the treasurer, the commissioner of revenue, and see how we work together to make it better. There was nothing that any one of us wouldn't do for any of each of us. And with him too. Mr. Goff also. Please come. Please spend time in the offices you're trying to classify. Sorry.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you for all the information.
So obviously, we need to advance or change directions, whatever the board's will is. I would ask us all to be thinking, we shouldn't be thinking about current humans. We're thinking about the organization. Mary knows this now. She has to go through and rebuild her organization. Both of her deputies are cycling through right now. The others aren't maybe there at some point in time. The sheriff is in a constant wheel, it seems like. And Debbie and Peggy, they have some pretty experienced individuals in their place right now, and I'm sure it's very hard to divorce the concept of what deputies do in the treasurer's office from Dawn and Lisa. And they're extremely capable individuals. I'm not speaking about that the clerks has extremely capable individuals as well. But that is not, we're not trying to think about Dawn and Lisa. We're trying to think about how do we build a structure so that people who are as interested in learning and growing as Donna, Lisa, Dee, and Caitlin can find a place here in the county and grow their skill level and their capability and the types of things they can do over time, from the point where they're given a list of things that they must do during a day, so they come in and they're ultimately responsible and know what to do and are completely trusted to get it done, and with no worry by the Constitution. And there's a continuum that happens from that first day of work to the day that you master a chief deputy. I think there's a way we can compensate that continuum and encourage people to continue to gain skills rather than saying, I'm maxed out, I need to go to some other locality to make more money. And I'd like to see a way to do that, to keep the quality-driven employees here.
It's intended to be a positive incentivizing measure. It's
Right.
not intending to be punitive or to set in place measurements that make people feel diminished. It's simply a tool to try to implement something across the board that everybody understands, and that people, if they don't think it's right, they can say, hey, this isn't fair, instead of comparing personalities and saying that, you know, from A to B it's not fair. That within that tool we can look at the information and see if it's functioning correctly.
Well, and I sort of hear you all saying the same thing, which is that there is no study or classification system that's fully going to encompass the scope of a single person that's working with you all, who's doing a gazillion things, that if you were to hire somebody and say, this is the job description, you all know that they do 4 times, 10 times that amount. And is what I'm hearing you all say. So I can see that when you have numbers on this side that correspond to a grade, it seems like it's an oversimplification maybe of what's actually happening. It's just my reflection on what I hear you all saying. But I want to thank you all, because Rappahannock is a special place and we operate like nobody else. And as you said, you've seen this place change so many times, you know, in the course of 40 years. And maybe this will give us some insight into, as Ms. Smith and Mr. Curry were saying, something that's valuable, you know, in terms of whether it's a career ladder or, you know, just a picture of some kind.
Mr. Whitson or Mr. Frazier?
Hi, it's Keir Woodson. I just want to make sure I heard Mr. Curry correctly, that the state requires some kind of, that we have some system in place. What, if my understanding is correct, what happens if we don't comply with that state requirement?
Probably the same thing that's happened up till now. You know, what this ultimately, from a legal perspective, I'm not a lawyer, and the reason why they call, Baker Tilly calls their system a SAFE, right, with their acronym, is that there are objective measures from an equal opportunity perspective between various employees doing very different things in the organization. And how do you compare salaries for somebody who is, you know, designing widgets versus drawing pictures? And they're 2 totally different things, but if you can find objective measures, which Baker Tilly does in their patented process, that is the attempt to do it in an objective way that is defensible. And that's why you're supposed to have classification systems. Now, legally, I have no idea what happens if you don't have one. Probably if you didn't have one and you had an equal opportunity thing pop up, you wouldn't have very good stuff. And
Right.
my note is to track down the code section so you can read it yourself.
And then my second question is, what action do you need from us tonight?
Well, I think A, if we need to take a left turn, then we need to know that. If you want us to continue developing what's happening now and bring it to more detail and fine tune the position descriptions where individuals currently should slide into that position description so that we can update the order of magnitude cost estimates. So again,
Yeah.
order of magnitude, kind of, that means the right number of zeros, and it could be a very different number from where it is right now.
Okay, do you need that in the form of a motion?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, but I mean, it seems obvious that, at least to me, that you should continue because you're waiting on what seems like pretty critical input from the most, if not all, the constitutional officers on the job descriptions. Isn't that correct?
I don't know. I wouldn't say waiting. I think it'll be probably be a cooperative process, and
Okay.
not asking them just to do it. We want to help and be part of that and share and try to bring consistency across the organization where we can in format and style, and
Yeah.
incorporate those
So, I mean-
distinct skills where we can.
Yeah, so I think you ought to continue that work and flesh this out and maybe get to more solid budget numbers in terms of these recurring costs so that we know what we're facing. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Frazier?
He might be in a spot where he can't speak.
Yep. I think for me, just going back to the restaurant analogy, what I think I'm hearing is instead of a salamander restaurant, I'm a Griffin Tavern restaurant. So instead of having 3 chefs, 4 sous chefs, 10 whatevers, I have 1 chef and I have 1 sous chef. And they better all know how to do the business because somebody's going to go on vacation. So in my mind, that's what I'm hearing from you all is, will we ever have 6 positions in the Commissioner of Revenue? No, but maybe that's part of what we should look at by having so many different levels in a department that doesn't ever think they're gonna have more than 3. Maybe that's making the skew in a weird way, or I don't know. It just seems to me that if you're never gonna have 6, why are we looking at 6? That's my input, I think, what I was hearing.
Yeah, and so we viewed it as greater opportunity, more incremental steps along the way that you can keep an employee who's brand new, never been a treasurer or a clerk in their life, and they walk in the door, but they're a very capable employee. They can start adding skills to their resume, and they can, as they layer in the various skills, they can move from job position to job position and command a higher salary, as opposed to just getting a COLA.
Yeah.
Which means they can continue buying the loaf of bread.
And this doesn't do away with the COLAs, as you said, as we adopt the COLAs, this will shift
That's
up.
right, that's right. Now,
So
we
this
would,
isn't the top of the ladder for everybody forever.
we would like to get to a point where we're able to recommend a COLA and a merit, and then the department heads have some role in how the merit is distributed based on performance. If you're exceeding expectations, maybe then there's a merit component that comes into, and that's how you would move up the scale in a particular grade. I've always said, I don't feel like I'm interested in talking about merit unless we can cover COLA. If you can't continue to buy the loaf of bread, then we don't have any business talking about merit. That's always been my position. And it's hard to keep up with COLA some days or some years. Mr. Frazier's on mute.
Yes, Mr. Frazier?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that, I had to mute it, for background noise here, but, this is very preliminary. I mean, this is the first time we've ever discussed anything like this as a board. And while I understand what the constitutional officers are saying, you know, we got to kind of work through this, but this is really our first stab at this.
Yeah,
There's really really not much more to say. I mean, I know each office is different, but I mean, that's just the way it is. We're all chief cooks and bottle washers in our individual lives and businesses.
Part of what we might be hearing is that it might be impossible to run one of our small offices with 2 trainees and a constitutional, right? It just means that constitutional would be glued to the office. So that may be not possible. Is it possible to do it with a chief deputy, a constitutional, and a trainee? Maybe. Or maybe 2 threes in it. So is there some permutation that works, or maybe there's just never a time when a trainee or a 1 or 2 would ever be appropriate in a small office? I don't know the answer to that. And that's based on those skills, the minimum skills, and whether it's performing tasks that are written down for you or designing the tasks yourself.
Well, thank you so very much for coming in this evening. It seems like we're going to continue this conversation for some time.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all.
Board members, if you have questions as you're digging through the information, reach out to Bobby.
I'll be by to visit.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas if we don't see you.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
All right, sign ordinance. Long readings.
We're not there yet. We're still in progress too. But I would you this up, Gary.
Yeah, happy to. Obviously, the board is aware that the planning commission, upon referral from the board of supervisors, has been working to amend the sign ordinance for a long time. Mr. Goff and I prepared a preliminary amended sign ordinance for the consideration of the planning commission, knowing that having something to look at and work from is a lot easier to make movement than just kind of starting with nothing. So we bit the bullet and provided them what we thought was a pretty solid package. The planning commission took a lot of time and went through what we provided and shaped it further themselves, and I think they made some very good changes. The 2 documents are attached showing a clean version, which I think is easier to read if you're trying to get the whole concept, and then a version that tracks changes from the current ordinance. I don't know how the board wants to work through this, but I should maybe point out a few of the very high points, if you will. Mr. Goff was heavily involved in the preamble and the intent. And let me back up to say all of this really is a result of Reed versus Town of Gilbert, Supreme Court case, which says you really can't regulate signs based on the content. And while it's not entirely true, if you have to read the sign to say how big or where it can go or how high it can be, then you're violating that. It's not totally that, but it's pretty close. And so what we sought to do is, from this ordinance where there's various, a political sign can be this big and can be up for this long, while a temporary sign for real estate can be this big and up for that long. And a farm sign can be this big, and all these different types of signs based on the content were regulated differently. Different size, different location, and you can't do that. They all have to be handled the same. All temporary signs need to be handled the same, mostly. And then permanent signs, there's a slight difference between commercial and non-commercial. Then permanent signs, similarly, we can't be saying if you have a movie theater or a gas station, you can have this size sign, but if you have a different place, you can have a that size sign. Oh, we can't get at that. Now, the way we get around it a few places here, we say signs located at a property that sells gas can have a certain size sign. Now, we can't tell them what they can put on that sign, but we can regulate specific requirements for that location. Properties that are for sale can have a temporary sign of this size. It's very likely they're going to put a sign up to sell the house for a realtor.
But it doesn't fully restrict it.
But it doesn't restrict it. It can be anything. But it's temporary. In that case, it's temporary. So that's the huge shift that has happened with this ordinance to fall in line with Reed versus Gilbert. And we talked a long time about the city of Norfolk trying to get their arms around this, and then the state local government attorneys group put together a model ordinance for localities, and this borrows from some of that. So where I was going to get to is this preamble that Mr. Goff put together, looking at some other ordinances, tries to set the stage. And this whole preamble is really, A, to inform the reader generally what the concept is, but B, if we ever go to court, this is the bottom line basis of all the decisions that are made throughout this ordinance are based on these ideals. And that's why it's all shown as new. Animated signs, as board is aware, right now, technically, all animated signs are not allowed in the county. And that means anything that flutters with the wind or blinks. And we have some of that, feather flags and things like that. So the question the staff asked was, should they be disallowed completely like they are today, or should we accommodate them in some limited fashion? The Planning Commission at the end of the discussion decided that in commercial zones, some limited number of animated signs driven by the wind should be allowed. Open flag, a feather flag that says propane or something like that. And this draft suggests that yes, as a temporary, you can have these animated signs in commercial areas, but only so high and only so much area. The other,
Can I just ask you,
Yeah.
do you want to get through this first?
need.
So what's the difference between a commercial flag and a non-commercial flag? Is it?
Well, from a flag standpoint, national flags, historical national flags, or state,
or
those are allowed, exempted.
Right.
Right. But a commercial flag, we can get into the public art side of things. There's the Wagmore Dogs case where the people had this giant mural on the side of their building.
Right.
But part of that mural was the mascot of their company.
Right.
Commercial,
Commercial, yeah.
no good. So that's the real difference, is that commercial doesn't, is there a commercial symbolism, wording, or otherwise? That's would be the difference between commercial and non-commercial, whether it's just several colors.
My thinking is pretty abstract here. It's that a agritourism commercial message. How do you, I mean, I know that that's probably complicated, but how are you going to define it?
Well, I think really,
If you possibly even, maybe you don't merchandise off it, but imagine it's a design, like someone's selling a t-shirt.
That would be a zoning administrator. Ultimately, these things come down to a human making a call. It's a zoning administrator making a call. And if somebody's agreed by that determination, they can appeal to the BZA. If they don't like the BZA said, they can go to the circuit court. If they don't like the circuit court said, they go to the appeals court. If they don't like the appeals court, they go to the Supreme Court. If they don't like that, they can,
Yeah, no, I knew a lot of the process, but I was just wondering if it gets squishy.
Well, and so that's, all of this really falls into that paradigm of various appeal mechanisms, because, I don't know if the term art use is gray, right? Some things you just can't put in words.
right, it's like a definition of obscenity, and I know I want to see it, but I can't legislate it. But what I think Mr. Curry and I tried to do, we went around the county and looked at what we had, all up and down the major roads, and okay, what do we have? And nobody's squawking about it, except maybe sometimes like Mr. Parrish's pet peeve was the little fluttering signs out by the winery down on Viewtown Road. But by and large, nobody's complaining about Craig Williams's vegetable for sale signs, or we got the hens and the eggs too. So we took pictures of everything so the Planning Commission could have it. Say fluttering signs up there at Thornton River Orchard and outside Sperryville. Fluttering signs several places, co-op, all kinds. Okay, so nobody's squawking. So is this a problem that needs to be fixed? So that was the first approach. Second approach was eliminate content regulation and focus on site regulation. Mm-hmm. So that there is content neutrality in this, and then there was a new wrinkle from the last election cycle, the hay bale signs. And that really fell outside of everything that we had and everything that I saw in other ordinances. That's kind of a brand new phenomenon, right? So we try to tackle that with the definition there is still, the localities can still regulate commercial speech to a greater extent than non-commercial speech. But also, really the key is cite where these things are cited, and you focus on not what they say, but the size and the type. So in a rural residential, fluttering flags are not allowed, but in highway commercial, they are, because that's where they are now and historically have been. So there's a nexus to, the historical experience, because right now we can say, well, these fluttering flags, we know that they haven't caused a traffic accident. So if we just outright ban them, where's the nexus to public safety, which has to be there in order for us to regulate anything? So at our level, at the locality level. So then there was this issue of public art, which was like, it's troublesome, conceptually, to try here to regulate that and legislate it. So I think what the attempt was, which I think in this particular version that's on your packet today, and that'd be a line like 168. There's something that's wrong with this, the way how this came out. I don't remember writing that, so that must have been
That came from the Planning Commission.
yeah, that doesn't make any sense right there. So that would have to be redone, and there's an and misplaced. And there's a couple, I could nitpick this thing, but by and large, I think we succeeded in eliminating content regulation. It was actually an easier task than I thought it was going to be. Once I sat down and really started focusing on our old ordinance, stuff jumped out, like the monastery sign. The monastery, that's a big definition in our current. Well, I was looking around, well, where's the monastery? Okay. Well, what's the need for this intensive regulation of the size of the monasteries or convent size? So, yeah, all that's eliminated in this effort, and I think the Planning Commission did do a lot of good, made a lot of good additions and thought it through very well. So I'm here to answer any questions regarding the legality of any particular aspects of it, but I think that we're almost ready to maybe have a public hearing on it after you all have time enough to digest it.
Yeah, some of the other big changes is organizationally grouping all the off-premise signs in one section, which is a new section 170.102.1, where they're sprinkled throughout directional signs, which we had in here, which means you can, and which are specifically referenced in Reed versus Town of Gilbert. You can say the name of the business and the direction you need to go. So it's not on the location of the business. One of our orchards or something like that is down a secondary road, but on a primary road, there might be appropriate location for a sign to say so-and-so orchard that way. And so that's listed in there, as well as other types of off-premise sign, which are something more than just directional. So it might be so-and-so orchard is that way, plus we have apples and all these other things. That becomes a requirement in addition to directional signage, and what the ordinance says is that those would be special exceptions. And so if there are special circumstances in which a business that is not located on a primary highway needs that extra signage, then that case-by-case scenario can be brought to the board, and the board can consider whether it's appropriate. Because you have many situations where that is in place today, but is not in keeping with the current ordinance.
Gary, you just mentioned it a little while ago, some language that you said the Planning Commission had added, but that Mr. Goff didn't. Could you point back to that?
I think right here, this last paragraph. And so regarding public art murals, the Planning Commission has bounced back and forth between whether it would be appropriate to regulate public art separately from signs as a different thing called public art, and that you would get a separate permit for public art, and it would be regulated differently than a sign, or just simply exempted from a definition of sign, and it's just not regulated. And so, there's a continuum of the side of your building from one color to 1,000 colors, and sooner or later you form those colors in certain shapes and they begin to look different than just the side of a barn. And then if you add the Wagmore Dog's little doggy in there, now you've broken rules. But if it's not commercial, then what this ordinance has gotten to this point, we don't care. Paint your house whatever you want to paint.
Well, but doesn't that then apply to a 400 square foot painting
Sure.
of anything?
Yeah. And you paint the side of your building however you want to paint the side of your building.
So in terms of that specifically, and I could be wrong here, but I thought that the main intention of this sign ordinance from the beginning was to not have a bunch of big signs in Rappahannock. And so you open up that door, you could have buildings that are just painted. Don't necessarily have to have words.
Well,
You can have that now.
yeah.
Can we have that now?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
You have a tough Second Amendment argument if it's not commercial in nature, and if it's on private property, and if it's painted in an artistic way, as a freedom of expression that relates to nothing commercial on that property or any other property, good luck. Didn't you see down in Florida, they had the Starry Night house? Someone painted their whole house to mimic Starry Night, and the county are lost.
So I guess my question is that then what is the point of exempting or making a differentiation of works of art or public?
Well, my recommendation was to treat it as a separate .1 article, public art separately, and that's how it came to the planning commission for that very reason, because my theory there was that first of all, okay, the Wagmore Dogs is the reason for that, because the zoning administrator is gonna look at the proposed artwork and say, this isn't public art, this is an advertisement for Eat at Joe's. So, no, you can't do it. That person's now agreed, goes to the BZA through the process. And we've built in, we've afforded our citizens, applying citizens, with that built-in procedural safeguard, that it's not arbitrary and capricious just on the part of the zoning administrator to say, I really think that ought to be a hotter shade of pink, therefore no. But a person has to look at it and say, no, that's commercial, okay? And that is absolutely a billboard. That's not just beautification.
so the flip side that the planning commission ultimately got to after hearing from the art community was that we don't need you permitting every piece of art. The zoning administrator eye comes as an enforcement action rather than saying, no, that's a sign. And you can't have a sign there and you didn't get a sign permit if it has that commercial angle to it. So if it has a commercial angle built into it, then it's a sign.
For sure.
Now, the way it went in was we were limiting the size of that public art consistently. And the art community rejected that in their communication with the planning commission.
So not to get too far in the weeds here, but how then do ARBs control the colors of the houses?
They can't.
ARBs?
Yeah.
I don't think they can control the color.
I don't think we want to get into those weeds there, we don't have one.
I'm just asking a legitimate question. I just want to fully understand this language here for my own purposes.
Well, I wish I could tell you the scholarly answer. I can give you the political answer, kind of. The Code of Virginia allows for the creation of architectural review boards as a statutory thing, as a statutory creature. And usually they're limited to historic preservation. So, again, there's a built-in procedure, a process of review, so that the decisions aren't completely arbitrary and capricious. Because I think the government can argue successfully, even in a First Amendment context, that there is a compelling governmental interest to keeping Williamsburg, Williamsburg. And to keeping Little Washington, Little Washington. So I don't think we're really out as far on a limb as some people do with the ARB type of an action. I do think the key to it is that it's like this welcome Sperryville sign. If that had come before the zoning administrator and a decision had been made that was reviewable by aggrieved persons, it would have been a whole lot easier. All of a sudden, now you're talking about enforcing. what was arguably an illegal sign under our ordinance, but a sign that everybody liked and wanted. But at the same time, it was breaking the law, right? That was the argument. So it seems to me it makes much more sense to fix things when they're just on paper than go into enforcement mode once you've got a 75 by 50 foot artwork or sign, whichever it may be. So that's why I think with public art, it really ought to be that .1 section.
But you have every artist coming to you saying, Mother, may I have art, which is problematic.
Right.
So, you know,
I just had a question. I think I don't know if there's an easy answer to this, but for Mr. Goff or Mr. Curry, I mean, taking a high-level view of this revised ordinance, do you feel like, as you presented it, it lends itself to relative ease of enforcement, given we have basically a zoning administrator?
yeah,
Is it an improvement in this regard?
yes, and particularly in temporary signage, and even the permanent signage. One of the main changes that happen here is that the date of first display is to be emblazoned on the rear of the sign. And that's critical for enforcement for a lot of different reasons, whether a sign is vested or not. But for a temporary sign that can be up for a set period of time, 100 days, the date of first display is critical on the back. So if a temporary sign is found, well, in the public right of way, it's illegal, right? And VDOT can resolve that issue. If a temporary sign is outside of the right of way and placed in a zone that it's allowed, which is pretty much everywhere, but it has no date of first display, it's illegal. It can be removed. If it has a date of first display and it's 100 days after that date, it's illegal. And so that solves one of the major issues with the current ordinance that states that you can have many different types of temporary sign for, I think it was 30 days. But somebody could go and pop a sign in for 30 days and then maybe during the next day pull it out and then stick it back in the ground. And so enforcement was impossible for temporary signs before. Now, somebody could just put a new date on the back of the sign. But at least we have an enforcement mechanism, and there are some that say we shouldn't allow any temporary signs. And that gets really problematic around politic time.
Yeah.
So I would not advise that.
In fact, that would violate state law.
Well, state law says you need to, you can't regulate political signs any differently than other temporary signs. I suppose you could probably ban them outright, but I don't think I would want to be the community that does it.
So if this were to go live, and I know we've got to go through a hearing and all that good stuff, how many letters of violation would have to go out? Do you have any idea?
Well, as Mr. Goff stated, we did our best to align this in many ways with what we saw in the field. And so there are many signs today that aren't necessarily vested. They've shown up since the current ordinance is in place in the 80s. And they're not in keeping with that ordinance. And some will come into conformity with this. But we would operate similarly to how we, and most localities operate now. We wouldn't go out hunting for signs to send violations. But if they're brought to our attention, the ordinance is what it is. And what I've said, and Michelle said to the Planning Commission along the way, picking the words in this document is a clarification to staff on what violation letters you want sent. This is the time to bring into the tent or exclude from the tent what you want to see. And please don't get upset with us when we send notices of violation to companies after you adopt this when a complaint comes in, because you're telling us you don't want these things and you do want these other things. And
one thing we did sort of leave to the planning commission was the actual sizes.
the sizes, the heights,
Yeah,
Things
like,
like
you know, how, a fluttering sign, okay, could it be 18 feet or only 8? Those were I thought was more appropriate for the planning commission to consider, and I think it's more appropriate even more so for this board to consider it, you know, after hearing from the public. And certainly a lot of business owners, I think, are gonna look at this and wonder if they're affected. And so I think we'll get a lot of really good feedback on some of the details, like how big, how tall, how many. You know, because you gotta account for the open signs, you know, the open sign flags, the sale flags, you know, association flags, Michelin star flags, all those kind of things. And so I'm not saying that the thing is just ready as it sits, but I do think it's real close once you get some actual public input about the how manys and how bigs.
So the discussion at the planning commission was, you know, is there anything in here that's dead on arrival to the board? Don't want to send it to public hearing at the planning commission if there's something that just doesn't sit well with the board. Let's get that ironed out between the two bodies before public hearing.
Correct.
And also, the Berkeley group can go through this in detail and provide comment back as well. They provided some very high-level thoughts with just a cursory view. But once it's set to the point where the bodies think it's about ready for public hearing in content, then the Berkeley group can go through and provide their input and discussion, can prompt them on murals and what they think about how it's handled and other facets of this. So we really need to know if there are things in here that you want to kick back to the planning commission and have them change drastically.
And you may have additional questions as you read through it and want to reach out to me or your member on the planning commission to see what the thought process is. It is a lot of filling in the blanks with numbers, and you know, we navigated it as best we could and what we thought would be reasonable, and tried to link everything back to zoning so it would all be defensible and not subjective. And just in terms of the flutter signs, in addition to where we were seeing them, we also thought that in terms of like highway, commercial, and all that zoning, people are passing by quickly. They tend to have larger road frontages. It's a sensible place to have those sort of signs. You're not trying to get 5 flutter signs on a half-acre lot in the middle of the village.
Right, highway commercial, or village commercial is not included in that.
Yeah.
And that's something that, you know, maybe you could look at and allow something different on village commercial, a lesser quantity as opposed to 0.
I have one question. When I read through this, I didn't quite understand on 170, 106, where it says lots of parcels with a solely residential use are not eligible for a sign permit.
Which line is that?
Sorry, 554.
Yeah, I believe this is out of the
Is that basically?
planning commission as well.
And then it follows on to the following types of signs should be allowed and it shall be exempt from the total sign area permitted in the subsection.
Right, so
So
what kind of signs, you're regulating 2 groups of signs, resource preservation, residential zones, and commercial industrial, right?
mm-hmm.
So resource preservation and residential is ag and conservation,
Mm-hmm.
plus all the residentials,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of signs can you have there?
Mhm.
Pretty much nothing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can have certain, let's see what it says, aggregate 32 square feet, but not if it's just a solely residential use. So we know often there are special exceptions for Williams.
Yeah, you mean there's no home business there?
It's residential, right? So
Right.
there are many non-residential uses in these places.
Right.
Those people can get a sign.
Right.
But if you just have a house and you're living there, you
Right.
don't get 32 square feet of sign.
No, even if you have a home business by right.
Well, they would, I'm not sure how we would apply that.
That's fine.
Well, there are permit exempt signs, and you are allowed to have a temporary sign not exceeding 4 square feet on any lot or parcel provided they meet the other requirements. And you may have a small sign, each of which has a total area not to exceed 2
Yeah,
square
now
feet.
ag,
So
there
you can
are,
have a shingle.
and several carve-outs
Yes.
for ag as well. If you have a
But-
farm, you can have your
Right.
farm sign and you can have a.
But there are home uses by right, but you're excluding them from a permit.
Right. So if
I just wanted to-
I'm in my house and I operate my CPA business out of
Exactly,
it,
yeah.
no, you cannot have a giant sign in front of your residential house, right? I mean, that's the point.
Right.
But if you want to go to a resident or a business area, you can have a big sign.
Well, it just seems interesting because it's a permitted use.
Sure.
And so that's my question though, is that like, I was just thinking it through and just saying, hey, we've decided this can be zoned permitted use, but we're not gonna permit you to have this.
So the impact due to cars coming and going might be zero, depending on what business you do, but then the impact on the community of a big sign is something we're not really interested in having.
But couldn't you allow for
Sure.
a permitted sign, but the sign's smaller?
Well, you can allow for anything.
Well, I'm just,
As long as it's not content.
I'm
Yeah.
reasonably asking here because it's like if somebody's allowed to have that in the zoning ordinance and ostensibly you're allowing them to do that because it's good for the community and it's good for the landowner or the resident, well then you want them to be able to facilitate their business
Yeah.
in the right way.
Yeah.
Not be like one of those things where it's like, well, hold on a second, why am I allowed to have this? This sign ordinance says that I can't even put up like a
Yeah, now I think if you're gonna
10
go
square
down
foot sign
that
that
road,
says, hey,
I
like,
would,
come a site.
I'd break
That
out,
would be allowed.
I would break down,
Anyway.
home occupations into two categories,
Mhm.
right? One that doesn't have visits and one that does, right? One that has customers, one that doesn't. So maybe those that draw customers might be allowed in fewer locations and they can have a sign. But the others, you want to have your CPA business in your dining room, fine. But we don't need a big sign advertising it because nobody needs to find you.
Except for the internet.
Right.
Right. Well, I think it's just sort of, is what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think generally fewer signs is where the staff and planning commission were trying to go, with the exception of the commercial areas trying to accommodate what's out there.
Well, I do agree with you. However, if we do think that there are appropriate home uses, we love other sources of revenue, and I would want to see those businesses that we deem to be okay in those areas to at least be able to advertise for in the right way, if we're going to say that we can do
You
it.
can have a shingle, and anything, like once people pull into your house and they're not on the road, and you can have something
Yeah.
that can't be seen from the road. So as people are coming up to your door, like in an area that only someone actually coming to your house can see, you can give them a confirming sign as they're coming up to knock on your door. Might be genius,
Like the
CPA,
floor mat.
saving you money every day.
But the other thing that was changed was the very last line of the entire ordinance, which is related to when special exceptions are in play. And this speaks to what you just noted, in a ag or resource conservation or residential, if somebody gets a special exception or special use permit, they were afforded the largest sign allowed in the commercial zone, automatically. And so many special exceptions were approved without any consideration of that. Others had something tacked on, but you don't get a big sign. And so this turns it around and says, if you get a special exception or special use permit and you want a big sign, you better ask for it as part of your special exception or special use permit, and it can be granted as part of that up to this size, but you don't automatically get it. And that identifies that, for example, a church might end up in a ag zone. It's allowed there through a special exception, you don't get it by right, but if you get a church approved,
Right.
then the board can also approve of the sign at the same time. If your church is already there, you can have a sign.
Well, I guess my question is like, for instance, in Sperryville, is that, a lot of that's residential village, right? Or wait, is it residential?
It's commercial
Trailing
village.
down, most of it's a commercial village, trailing down it's village residential, highway is all highway commercial.
Okay.
So again, we want to carve in, if you have one of these parcels and it's not residential now, then we want to allow you to have your sign. But if it's
Right.
solely residential, we don't need every single house in Chester Gap having a 32 square foot sign.
And of course, a lot of the buffer areas are agricultural, and you know, we want open agricultural,
Yeah.
beautiful areas, and so, you know, we did allow, you know, for some of that off-site signage and that sort of thing, but I
So-
think not as obnoxious.
The other thing in here is that pretty much, most anything from size, it can come to the board for a special exception. So if you have some, you're way off, the highway right-of-way is really far away, or something is out of ordinary for you, and there's a special situation that maybe the sign size limit in the ordinance doesn't suit your need, you can come ask for something larger. And the board can consider it, allow the public to weigh in, and see how that works out.
So the main purpose tonight was to seek feedback from the board on the language that's in place currently. We did toy with the idea of having a joint meeting, but with the other prospective joint meeting that hasn't materialized yet, it seemed like maybe a lot to bite off in the joint meeting, and we were, just trying to make some headway with this.
Makes
So
sense.
certainly if there's anything that gives you pause, let us know. We're happy to take it back up.
You guys have done a massive amount of work here, a lot of thinking through.
Couple of long nights. We try to stay fresh and keep it moving.
So for me, the ease for the citizen to understand it without it being so crazy complicated, and then consistency for the zoning decisions made, so that one person gets approved and the other one does not, and then you've got citizens wondering, why is that? Was it more of a personality thing versus the regs?
Yeah, so zoning administrator always wants it as objective as possible, but there has to be, if it's that rigid, then it makes it difficult for citizens to sometimes fit into the very peculiarly shaped peg holes. So try to have it as objective and specific as possible while giving a little bit of room for a zoning administrator to apply the ordinance to a situation that wasn't foreseen when anybody was putting words in.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you and I spoke about it, Gary, you maybe mentioned possibly being able to have some kind of guidance. Like,
Yes,
I want
yes.
people to be able to go to the zoning office and say, I'm trying to be in compliance, what do I need to do? Because this is complicated, and there's 90 pages here, and what am I allowed to do with a temporary sign?
Yeah, and so, so the ordinance does have to be purposely driven and written from a legal standpoint, and be challenged in court when we need it to stand up in court. But there can be companion guidance documents to help people understand the typical type of application they might have in the process they would jump through to I have this sort of thing, what can I do?
Yeah, okay.
And what, to your point, Van, that is that if you've got a by right, home occupation, cottage industry, what people kind of know that's allowed in a certain zoning district, one of the compromises I think staff would agree on suggesting to the board is, right now you've got a two by two sign. Maybe you might want to visit and make it 3 by 3, or something, so that there is the possibility that a person who's advertising a home occupation of whatever kind, because we don't want to read it to make that determination, you just make it possible for them to have a bigger sign. Does that mean that automatically everybody's going to opt for the bigger sign? No, not necessarily.
Right, I understand what you're saying.
A lot of home occupation businesses too are by appointment, and they don't really want people popping in. They just want to be able to be found.
And we didn't see a whole lot of home occupation signs driving around the county. I mean, I didn't, I don't know if Gary did, but we were out there with our cameras snapping every sign.
And our zoning ordinance is set up such that they don't need to come get permits.
Yeah.
So they're just out there.
Yeah, no, I don't think
They're a by right accessory use in certain types, and they're just allowed. And because our zoning ordinance does not mandate every use to get a permit, which I think should be changed, then they just kind of exist in the ether until somebody challenges it.
All right, so how do we move forward?
Madam Chairman, can the public be heard at all on this?
Public comment was earlier.
Yeah.
Yes, but the subject matter was not before the public, and I did not know what you're saying at that time. And I waited here for an hour and 40 minutes. All I want to do is get some clarifications before the planning commission. Well, I will like to speak then.
The planning commission is meeting.
All I want to know is,
One
May
second.
I?
One second.
So there
I think,
will be public hearings.
right, there's a lot of opportunity for additional feedback on this. both at the planning commission and at the board level before we move anything forward for even advertisement, let alone adoption. That being said, I appreciate very much that Mr. Pelican sat here for quite a long time, and he doesn't live in my district. But if you just had something brief to say, I would like to hear what he has to say.
The board's okay with that, I am too as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you.
Come up to the
Thank
microphone.
you so much.
I don't want him to show up mad at the planning commission and it'll be all my fault.
No, I appreciate you, Ms. Smith, and I appreciate the committee. Tom Pelican, I live in Mr. Carney's district, very happy. Mr. Carney and I drive every morning into the little village of Woodville, Virginia. It says, "Welcome to Woodville." This is what it also says. I would like to show you. It's important that I make this available, which I have, which I lost, which is because I waited so long to give it to you.
The
But I'll
phone
give
is
it to
still
you.
alive.
Anyway, I'll find it now.
Technology is great when it
I will
works,
tell
isn't
you.
it?
It's political science. We talked about this before. I need to find out if this proposal that we're discussing has any input on the ordinance of the county restricting the placement and removal of political signs.
So, presumably, the political sign is a temporary sign,
That's what it is now.
and temporary signs are all handled the same.
Are what?
Handled the same under the new ordinance based on size and duration. And so they would be allowed to be up only for a certain duration and could not be placed within the VDOT right of way.
And they can be removed in a timely fashion?
Well, zoning enforcement is a different animal, and
I'm sure Mr. Fraser is listening right now, because the last time it was before the board, it was on the subject matter. Mr. Fraser told me it's freedom of speech, they can leave them up forever. That's what Mr. Fraser told me. Mr. Fraser said the Supreme Court ruled. The Supreme Court never ruled, Mr. Fraser. I've talked to attorneys who've been before the Supreme Court. I've talked to a former supervisor who served on the board of supervisors. There's no ruling that says the Supreme Court ruled on that.
Well, I
So
think
Mr. Fraser was wrong.
I think the confusion is how the Reed versus Town Gilbert decision interplays with our current ordinance and our ability to enforce our current ordinance. I believe that's what Mr. Fraser was getting to in the past, and it's problematic for us to enforce the current ordinance, which is why a new ordinance is appropriate that could be enforced. Now, going through the enforcement process could be lengthy, and like Reed versus Town of Gilbert, could get you in the Supreme Court of the United States. So we can't guarantee that a sign would be removed, but we could work through and treat all
Just
signs
pass this
fairly.
around, please.
Oh, I mean, there's political signs up all over the county.
No, but there's not like that though. And those are 6 years old.
6 years old.
Those signs are 6 years old. That's what we see in Woodville. Welcome to Woodville, America.
Well,
That is welcome to Woodville. It's not welcome to Sperryville, it's not welcome to Amosville, it's welcome to Woodville. They've been there for 6 years, and they've been building and building and building. And I'm told by Mr. Fraser, that's freedom of speech. And it may be. It may be.
Point of order, I have no idea of the conversation, no recollection of what Mr. Pelican is talking about, and I'm sure that whatever I said was legitimate, but I don't, just
Well, you were
because
interrupted and you were told.
somebody has a misunderstanding of what they're told 2 or 3 years ago, it should have no bearing on what we're talking about tonight.
You're wrong, Mr. Fraser. It was just recently, within the last few months, and Ms. Smith interrupted you and told you you were interrupting me.
Mr. Pelican,
I just wanted to say, please don't make me regret asking to recognize you, because I really find that it's not helpful to make this about personalities and to call out board members that aren't even here to defend
And
themselves.
he's here.
Excuse me, I wasn't finished speaking either, Mr. Pelican. But my point is that we have a policy on this board to address your comments to the board and not to call out individual members of the board. We are attempting to put in place a system that helps people recognize and identify both their abilities and their rights in putting up signs on their property. There are a lot of nuances in signage that I have to tell you, I never would have anticipated when I threw my hat in the ring.
But we have an ordinance.
I didn't interrupt you, Mr. Pelican, and I'm asking you to please let me complete what I'm saying. I intervened with you with our chair. Your behavior is a reflection on me.
Of course it is.
I vouched for you. So we are attempting to come to a place where we have a system in place that helps with a lot of these nuances. There will always be nuances that we can't reconcile with legislation. Always. There will be. I'm telling you that now. I can't promise you it'll take care of those signs, because someone could say if their person loses the election, it's a protest sign, and I'm going to keep it up as long as I want. And now it's an expression of my free speech. I wish I could tell you otherwise. I'm shooting it to you straight. I don't want you to leave angry, but we're trying.
Your memory is very short. It was a few months ago. You interrupted Mr. Frazier. You said, Mr. Frazier, he has the floor. Don't interrupt him. Mr. Frazier continued. He said, it's freedom of speech. The Supreme Court ruled on it. You were there, ma'am. It was a few months ago.
Sir, again,
It
we're
wasn't 3 years
targeting
ago.
individual members of this board,
I'm
and I
sorry.
did not take any contention with anything you said.
I'm just saying, I
simply asked
wanted to
you
know
quit
if
targeting
the ordinance,
individual
if
members
that
of this
ordinance
board.
is going to be changed in the county.
There's an amended ordinance before the board to consider leading up to public hearings that changes how temporary signs will be handled.
To the
And it is our belief that the new wording would provide staff greater abilities to enforce the ordinance. The current ordinance is not enforceable owing to the U.S. Supreme Court case Reed versus Town of Gilbert. So it's a work in progress, and their hope is that it will be better than what we have now. And enforcement will be easier, although arduous. If someone really wants to fight it, it's a court battle, and we'll have to go down that path.
And my
Mr. Chairman,
suggestion
I
would
went to
be,
your office recently, you gave me the new ordinance of the state. The state ordinance says no locality shall have the authority to prohibit the display of political campaign signs on private property if the signs are in compliance with zoning and right-of-way restrictions applicable to temporary non-political signs if the signs have been posted with permission of the owner. The provision of this section shall supersede the provisions of any local ordinance or regulation in conflict with this section.
I don't
That's
think I gave that to you.
You did, I got it in your office.
Well, somebody might have printed it for you.
Well, they did, they gave it to me at the same time.
Okay. What you just read is that we can't regulate political signage any differently than we regulate temporary signage. The new proposed ordinance regulates temporary signage. They can be regulated equally. We cannot differ between one and the other.
Okay. I apologize to the entire board for taking this opportunity to express myself. I feel very strongly about the fact that my supervisor and I have to drive through town each day and see litter. And I wish we didn't have to. There's worse things to see. We have a sign in Sperryville, Virginia, which is more ugly than anything I've talked about. And all of you know about it.
Mr. Pelican,
It's public.
what I would suggest, we're.
I appreciate the time you gave me. Thank you,
Come to the
Chairman.
public hearing.
I will. Yes, and I appreciate that because
That's what it's for.
I wanted to know something. Thank you, and I found it out. Thank you.
All right, I think we're done on sign orders. Mr. Frazier, Mr. Winston, did you have anything else on the signs before we move to adjournment?
So,
No, well, we do have, I mean, I think Mr. Beard is about to say it. I mean, I think we need to make a decision tonight whether we want to move to a public hearing on this.
Or just the first?
so here's what I would recommend based on this discussion. Perhaps allow Mr. Goff and I to go through with a fine-tooth comb, share it to the Berkeley group, allow them to go with a fine-tooth comb, see what, if any changes there might be, get that back in front of the board, and then you all can make a decision to push it back to the Planning Commission for public hearing.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, yeah, and I also want to just take a minute, and I've said it before, I just want to reiterate, I appreciate Ms. Smith stepping into the Planning Commission role in my absence, and I know when I was earlier in the summer, we got started on this, but I realized looking at the current work product, a lot more went into it. So thank you for that, and thanks to the planning commission members who met during various work sessions to advance this, and obviously thanks to Mr. Goff and Mr. Curry as well. I mean, I'd like to get this on the books sooner rather than later, and I do agree with Mr. Goff that it's pretty darn close. So hopefully we won't have to wring our hands much longer over the nitty gritty, and we can just get something on the books, and as long as we're all comfortable that's enforceable, I think that's the key. We're recognizing that our enforcement team is basically one person. So, but I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I think we're close.
Thank you. All right.
Well, that's the plan, then we'll send it back to the planning commission after some further review and suggestions. And thank you, Mr. Whitson. And I know everyone on the planning commission looks forward to the day that you join us again. And I'm happy to serve as an alternate for as long as you need.
Thanks a lot.
Ready?
I'm ready.
You're ready?
Motion to adjourn?
Oh, second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, Mr. Frazier. Thank you, Mr. Whitson.
Thank you.
Here.